What if I told you that the future King of England just made a decision so personal, so final, that it shook the very foundation of his family? Prince William has officially banned Prince Harry from his 43rd birthday celebration. No invitation, no phone call, not even a text. But why? And what does this silent rejection really say about the state of the royal family? Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about a birthday, it's the moment the brotherhood broke forever. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't an official statement from Kensington Palace. And it certainly wasn't a headline written with any trace of formality. But it landed like a thunderclap in both royal and global circles. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Prince William, heir to the throne, model of restraint, and arguably the last thread holding what remains of royal unity together, had made a personal choice. A painful one. An unthinkable one to anyone still clinging to hope of reconciliation between the once inseparable brothers. He would not be inviting Prince Harry to his 43rd birthday party. There was no negotiation, no debate. The guest list was locked, the plans underway, and the message, while never publicly spoken aloud, echoed through palace corridors and Montecito gardens alike. The door was closed, and Harry wasn't welcome. For those on the outside, the story might seem like just another chapter in the long, winding royal drama, a soap opera between siblings magnified 1,000-fold by centuries of tradition and tabloid magnification. But for those watching closely, this was different. This wasn't just about a party. This was a turning point, a symbolic act of finality, a line drawn not in sand, but in stone. Because birthdays in the royal family aren't just personal affairs, they are political moments. They are opportunities for public unity, carefully choreographed optics, and subtle messaging to the world about the state of relationships behind palace doors. The absence of Harry wasn't just noticed, it was loud, deafening, and deliberate. But to truly understand the weight of this exclusion, to grasp the emotional undercurrent behind Prince William's decision, we have to go back. Not just to the Netflix docuseries, not just to the Oprah interview, but to the very pages of Harry's memoir, Spare, the book that promised a window into the inner workings of royal life, but instead detonated a bomb in the middle of the firm. In Spare, Harry laid bare years of grievances. Stories that, for generations, would have remained locked behind castle gates were suddenly splayed across the globe. There were revelations about mental health, his struggle with grief after Diana's death, Meghan's mistreatment, the cold indifference of courtiers, and perhaps most damaging of all, a visceral account of a physical altercation between the brothers themselves. William, according to Harry's writing, had shoved him into a dog bowl. That image, so bizarre, so domestic, and yet so symbolic, became the shorthand for a relationship in crisis. It turned what could have been interpreted as family tension into a physical, violent episode. It wasn't just a dig at William's character. It was a challenge to his dignity, his image, his role as the future king. And it wasn't whispered in private or hinted at through press leaks. It was written, printed, sold, and consumed by millions. From that moment on, something changed in William. Those close to him noticed it first, not in words, but in posture, in the tightening of his jaw when Harry's name came up, in the sudden shift in tone during media engagements that even slightly referenced Spare. William, who had endured years of criticism without public rebuttal, was not known for emotional outbursts or impulsive decisions. But something inside him cracked. Not loudly, quietly, almost invisibly. But it was enough. Enough for him to decide that, on the most personal day of his year, he would not extend an olive branch. There would be no invitation, no peace offering, no seat at the table for his younger brother. It's important to understand what this birthday represented. Turning 43 is not, in and of itself, a milestone birthday. But for William, this year marked a significant moment. It was his first birthday since fully stepping into his role as Prince of Wales under King Charles's reign. It was a year defined by quiet leadership, behind-the-scenes diplomacy, and an effort to steady the monarchy amid post-Elizabethan uncertainty. His birthday was to be more than cake and candles. It was a symbolic moment of stability, a gathering of trusted family, loyal friends, and key figures in his life as future monarch. For William, every decision surrounding this event mattered. Every name on the guest list had weight, and Harry's name, once carved in permanent ink on every family roster, was now missing entirely. This wasn't just a snub. This was a statement. The fallout was immediate. Insiders whispered to reporters. Royal commentators pounced. Even those who had long defended Harry found themselves asking, Had the memoir gone too far? And yet, from Montecito, there was silence. Harry didn't issue a statement. Meghan didn't allude to the snub in her usual polished appearances. There was no Instagram caption dripping in subtext. But sources close to the couple said everything that needed to be said. Harry was hurt. Deeply. Not shocked, perhaps, but wounded all the same. Because for all the noise, all the interviews, all the books and camera crews and podcasts, there remained one quiet hope in Harry's heart, that one day, he and William would talk. Not in front of cameras. Not through publicists. But as brothers. As sons of Diana. As the two boys who once chased each other through Balmoral's corridors and stood shoulder to shoulder at their mother's funeral, bound together by grief. That hope, however faint, had been alive. Until now. Because the birthday invitation that never came didn't just represent a forgotten gesture, it was the final nail in a bond already splintered by years of emotional turbulence. It confirmed what many in the royal inner circle had begun to believe, that this rift was no longer a crisis. It was the new reality. The brothers were no longer on opposite sides of a debate. They were on opposite sides of a wall. But perhaps the most painful element in all of this is what wasn't said. There were no angry public statements from William. No sharp rebukes. No press briefings slamming Harry for his book. William, as ever, chose silence. And in that silence, he let the gesture speak for him. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because William's choice not to invite Harry, his decision to deliberately exclude his own brother from the one day that should bring family together, said more than any speech ever could. It said, "I'm done." It said, "You went too far." It said, "This isn't reparable anymore." For those watching from the outside, it's tempting to wonder if reconciliation is even possible at this point. Can brothers who've weathered such deep emotional storms ever find their way back to common ground? Can public wounds be healed in private? And what role does the crown play in facilitating or obstructing that healing? Those questions will be explored in the chapters ahead. We'll examine the ripple effect of Harry's memoir, the role Meghan played in amplifying or insulating him from fallout, William's quiet resilience, Charles's regretful neutrality, and the deeper, more human cost of royal life, the family bonds severed in pursuit of autonomy and public truth. Because beneath all the pomp and ceremony, all the tiaras and tailored suits, there are still siblings. Still parents. Still wounds that ache in the quiet. And this birthday? It wasn't just a celebration. It was a signal. A royal, unmistakable message that the cost of telling one's truth, however cathartic, however justified, sometimes means accepting that not everyone will stay by your side when the candles are lit. The guest list was drawn. The seats were assigned. And Prince Harry's name was nowhere to be found. The fallout from Prince Harry's exclusion from Prince William's 43rd birthday celebration didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't some random decision spurred by a single disagreement or a brief lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of years, decades, even of shifting dynamics, bruised egos, and unspoken resentments between two brothers born into the most scrutinized family on earth. To understand how we arrived at the moment William effectively shut the door on his younger brother, we have to go back. Long before the book, long before Meghan, and long before the world split into Team William and Team Harry. Back to a time when the brothers were still just boys trying to navigate a life none of them chose. They were, for a time, each other's only true confidants. From the outside, the young princes seemed to live a life of privilege, castles, chauffeurs, holidays in Africa, and the endless affection of the public. But behind the gilded gates was a much more complicated truth. The death of their mother, Diana, in 1997 marked the dividing line between childhood and everything that followed. It was a trauma they shared, but they carried it differently. William, just 15, was expected to hold it together. He was the heir, the future king. He had to lead by example, even in grief. Harry, at 12, was given a little more leeway, but his rebellion would come later. In those early years, though, the bond between the brothers was forged in that shared loss. Walking side by side behind their mother's casket, nodding silently at the flowers outside Kensington Palace, enduring the public mourning with their heads held high. It was trauma masked by tradition, and only the two of them truly understood it. As they grew older, their roles became more defined. William, ever the responsible one, gravitated naturally toward his royal duties. He was studious, protective, and often restrained in public settings. He learned early how to navigate the institution's expectations. His future was mapped out for him in ink and legacy. Harry, by contrast, became the spare. It was a label he would eventually use for the title of his memoir, but it was one he felt long before it became a book cover. Being second meant freedom, but it also meant invisibility. He was the charming, cheeky younger brother who got away with more, but who also lived under a constant shadow. Not just William's shadow, but the looming presence of what it meant to be royal without being the royal. And yet, through much of their 20s, they remained close. They lived together for a time, attended events side by side, trained in the military and deployed. Their camaraderie was genuine, even if tinged with the undercurrent of duty. Everything began to change when they each fell in love. William's relationship with Kate Middleton, now the Princess of Wales, was steady, private, and long. Their eventual marriage was a milestone not just for them, but for the monarchy. The public adored Kate. The press largely respected her. She fit the mold, or so it seemed. William's life became one of dual devotion, family, and future crown. Harry, however, took a different path. When he met Meghan Markle, the change was immediate. She wasn't just a girlfriend. She was something else. An actress, an activist, an American, divorced, outspoken. She brought a new energy into Harry's life, one that promised freedom from the rigidity of royal life. And Harry, who had long bristled at institutional expectations, embraced it fully. At first, the royal family welcomed her, or at least tried to. But behind the scenes, tensions began to grow. The infamous stories of tiaras, tears, and tabloid leaks weren't just isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a much deeper misalignment between Meghan's approach and the traditions of the monarchy. And William noticed. According to multiple palace sources, William grew concerned, not just about Meghan herself, but about the pace of the relationship, the media narrative surrounding them, and the long-term implications for the family's unity. He reportedly expressed these concerns to Harry, not in anger, but in brotherly caution. It did not go well. Harry saw it as judgment, as another royal trying to keep him in line, as someone failing to understand that Meghan was not just his partner but his escape. That conversation, according to many accounts, marked the beginning of the real rift. It wasn't a fight, not yet, but it was the first time Harry began to see William not as his ally, but as an obstacle. After the wedding, which William dutifully supported despite any private doubts, the divide became more obvious. Meghan and Harry's household split from William and Kate's. What had once been a shared operation became two separate entities. Staff removed. Advisors divided. Schedules rarely overlapped. Then came the Sussexes' departure from royal life in 2020 Megxit. What was presented to the public as a need for privacy and independence was, behind the scenes, a bitter negotiation. Harry and Meghan's departure blindsided many in the royal family, particularly William. The brothers reportedly barely spoke during the months leading up to the decision. When Harry finally informed the family, it wasn't a conversation, it was a declaration. From that point on, things deteriorated quickly. The Oprah interview in 2021 deepened the wounds. Allegations of racism, emotional neglect, and abandonment filled the airwaves. While Harry didn't name William directly, the implications were clear. The image of the cold, indifferent brother was painted, if not in words, then in tone. Still, William didn't respond. Then came the Netflix docuseries, 6 episodes of curated home videos, diary entries, and allegations. The narrative was consistent. Meghan was misunderstood. Harry was trapped. The royal family was either complicit or silent. Still, William didn't respond. And then, finally, came the book, Spare. In it, Harry pulled no punches. He recounted an alleged physical altercation with William. He described William as short-tempered, critical, and, at times, condescending. The book framed William not just as the heir, but as the antagonist. The polished prince who never truly had to fight for his place, who looked down on Harry's choices, and who, in the end, failed him as a brother. William, again, said nothing. But those close to him noticed the difference. The bond, already strained, was severed. Which brings us to the present day. And the birthday that broke what little remained. When William began planning his 43rd birthday celebration, he knew it would draw attention. As the future king, every personal moment is examined for subtext. And he knew that an invitation to Harry would be seen as a potential olive branch, a sign that healing was possible. But after everything, after Oprah, after Netflix, after Spare, that invitation never came. Not because of pride, not because of optics, but because, as one close aide put it, William has nothing left to give him. For years, William absorbed the blows. He watched his family become the subject of worldwide criticism. He stayed silent as headlines declared him distant and unfeeling. He remained composed as his own brother laid bare their darkest moments for the world to consume. And still, he tried to keep the door open. But when Harry put it all in writing, when he made their most private conflict part of his public brand, William closed that door. Quietly. Permanently. Because for him, this wasn't just about brotherhood. It was about the monarchy. About legacy. About protecting the institution that he will one day lead, and that Harry had seemingly walked away from with fire in his wake. That's what makes this birthday so significant. It wasn't just about who was on the guest list. It was about who wasn't. It was about the message William was sending, not to the world, but to Harry. That their paths, once so closely aligned, now run in completely different directions. One toward the throne. The other toward a freedom that came with a price. And the cost? Each other. It's rare for a single book to split a family, devastate a monarchy, and reshape the way the public sees one of the most iconic institutions on Earth. But Prince Harry's memoir Spare did exactly that. From the moment the title was revealed, it sent a wave of unease through royal circles. The word spare alone was a loaded statement, a subtle but unmistakable confirmation of what many suspected Harry had always felt, that he was secondary, disposable, an afterthought. The heir and the spare. William and Harry. First and second. But the damage didn't come from the cover. It came from the pages. When the book hit shelves in January 2023, it ignited a firestorm. It wasn't just a book, it was a confession. A reckoning. A thunderous, unrelenting account of Harry's version of royal life, filled with personal anecdotes, childhood trauma, brutal assessments, and most shockingly, explosive revelations about his closest family members. At the center of it all stood his brother, Prince William. Unlike previous interviews or documentaries where the royal family was referenced only in broad, ambiguous terms, Spare was direct. Names were named. Moments were documented. Feelings were unfiltered. The tone wasn't vengeful, but it was raw. It was personal. And it was permanent. One of the most widely discussed passages described a physical altercation between the two brothers. According to Harry, the confrontation took place in 2019 at Nottingham Cottage, Harry's residence at the time. The argument, as he described it, centered around Meghan. William allegedly referred to her using derogatory language, accused her of being difficult, abrasive, and rude. Harry said he tried to defuse the tension, but William became physically aggressive. He pushed Harry, sending him sprawling over a dog bowl which cracked beneath him. The image of the two royal brothers, sons of Diana, symbols of unity after her death, coming to physical blows in a modest kitchen over the American actress who changed everything, was as surreal as it was painful. It wasn't just tabloid gold. It was an emotional sledgehammer. The passage painted William not as a composed heir to the throne, but as a man overwhelmed by frustration and resentment. And while Harry claimed he didn't retaliate in that moment, the damage extended well beyond the walls of that cottage. It rewrote public perceptions of their relationship. It gave fuel to those who already viewed the palace as cold and dysfunctional. It also made reconciliation, which had already seemed improbable, almost impossible. But that was only one chapter. Elsewhere in the memoir, Harry detailed private conversations, including one following Prince Philip's funeral where he, William, and Charles attempted to hash out their differences. According to Harry, the conversation devolved into shouting and circular arguments. He felt dismissed, unheard. He wrote that his father pleaded, "Please, boys, don't make my final years a misery." That line stuck. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was tragically human. Here was a father, now king, watching his sons publicly unravel. The plea wasn't royal. It was paternal. And it emphasized what Spare did best, peel back the layers of ceremonial politeness to reveal the aching, imperfect family underneath. Harry also criticized William's relationship with the press. He implied that William, along with the palace institution, had an unspoken agreement with certain media outlets. They would leak or provide access in exchange for favorable coverage. Harry saw this as a betrayal. He claimed Meghan had been thrown under the bus to protect others, namely William and Kate. He described a hierarchy within the family not based on birthright, but on public relations. William was protected. Harry was not. In one particularly cutting section, Harry described how his brother and sister-in-law, then the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, reacted to Meghan. They were reportedly uneasy from the start. Cultural differences, generational differences, and different ideas of duty created awkwardness. While the public hoped for a new Fab Four, William, Kate, Harry, and Meghan, that vision unraveled quickly. According to Harry, it wasn't just tension, it was coldness. Even small moments, like a joke misunderstood or a hug denied, were described as signs that Meghan had never been truly welcomed. And in Harry's mind, William stood at the center of it all, not just failing to defend Meghan, but quietly reinforcing the distance. But perhaps the most jarring feature of Spare wasn't the specific incidents, it was the tone. Harry wrote not like a prince, but like a man reckoning with a lifetime of silence. He wanted people to know his pain, to understand the cost of being the Spare, not just in the shadow of his brother's crown, but in the expectations that came with it. He revealed his teenage experimentation with drugs, his grief over Diana, his resentment toward the press, his complicated feelings about Camilla, his struggles in the military. It was a deeply human portrait, and for many readers, it struck a chord. But for his family, especially William, it struck a nerve. Because even if the stories were true, they were supposed to remain behind the curtain. That was the deal, unspoken though it may be. Royals don't confess. They endure. By breaking that rule, Harry didn't just burn bridges. He scorched the entire pathway between himself and his brother. In private, William was reportedly devastated by the book's release. He made no public comment, no statement, no leaks of his own, but insiders noted the change. His already reserved demeanor grew colder. His trust in Harry, already fragile, shattered completely. And yet, even after all that, there remained a small hope, especially among the public, that time might heal the damage, that the brothers could find a way back to each other, that someday, maybe quietly, they'd meet, talk, and begin the long process of repair. But that hope began to fade when Spare topped the bestseller list and sold millions of copies within days. When Harry began his global press tour, giving interviews where he doubled down on his claims. When clips circulated of Harry saying he still loved his family, but that they've shown absolutely no willingness to reconcile. To William, those interviews likely felt like further betrayal. Reconciliation isn't something you campaign for on late-night talk shows. It's something you pursue behind closed doors. The chasm widened. The palace, as always, maintained its stance of silence. Never complain, never explain. But the silence wasn't neutral. It was pointed, it was purposeful, and it was loud. The decision to exclude Harry from William's birthday celebration didn't begin with a party planner. It began with a manuscript, with a choice to take private pain and make it public, with a story that millions read, believed, and repeated. Harry may have wanted to reclaim his truth, but in doing so, he also lost something. The shared language of brotherhood. The unspoken loyalty that had survived wars, funerals, and scandals. By putting it all in print, he made his final statement. And now, William had made his. In the early summer months of 2025, as the royal calendar began to fill with ceremonial duties, diplomatic events, and quiet retreats to Sandringham and Balmoral, a much smaller yet emotionally charged event was being quietly coordinated behind the gates of Kensington Palace, Prince William's 43rd birthday celebration. There were no national announcements, no grand teasers dropped to the press. This wasn't a coronation or state dinner. It was, on the surface, a personal affair, an intimate birthday gathering of family, close friends, trusted aides, and a carefully selected few from William and Kate's inner circle. And yet, beneath the low-key invitations and private RSVPs, this event would become one of the most symbolic gestures in recent royal memory. For weeks, planning went on in hushed tones. The setting was to be relaxed, dignified, and full of warmth. Not lavish, but meaningful. A private dinner at Windsor's Adelaide Cottage had been suggested, though Kensington's more traditional residence remained a contender. Whichever location was chosen, one thing was clear. This was more than a birthday. This was a moment, an opportunity to reset, to reinforce the image of William as the steady, composed pillar of the monarchy during a time when public trust in royal affairs was fragile at best. Those tasked with organizing the event worked discreetly. Invitations were handwritten, not emailed. The guest list, though modest in size, was meticulously crafted. There would be no press photographers at the entrance, no leaks to the Daily Mail in exchange for favorable coverage. This was to be William's moment, not as the heir apparent, but as a man, a husband, and a father surrounded by those he trusted most. Except one name was never written. Prince Harry. Not in Draft 1. Not in Revision 3. Not even in the earliest brainstorms where someone might have asked, should we? Because by that point, the answer had already been internalized by everyone who knew William. No. Harry would not be invited. The omission wasn't cold. It wasn't even vengeful. It was considered, thoughtful, quietly resolved after months, years of mounting frustration, unspoken grief, and public silence. For William, the decision was personal. As the date approached, conversations within the household grew more focused. Kate, ever the voice of balance, supported her husband's choice. Those close to her say she had long tried to encourage peace between the brothers, especially for the sake of their children. She had reached out after the funeral. She had smiled politely through awkward joint appearances. But even she had limits. The last straw, for both of them, had not been the Netflix documentary, nor the Oprah interview. It had been Spare, and more specifically, what it represented. Not just a collection of grievances, but a burning of bridges. A public record of wounds they had never consented to make public. For William, this book wasn't just painful, it was unforgivable. By June, the guest list was final. William would celebrate surrounded by people who had stayed through the chaos. Their longtime private secretary, a few friends from university days, several senior aides who had helped him navigate the post-Elizabeth transition, close cousins, and of course, Kate and the children. And then, there was the call. Some decisions can be made quietly. Others must be spoken aloud. According to insiders, the idea of a final phone call to Harry, if not to invite him, then to at least acknowledge the absence, was floated early in the process. Perhaps a gesture of courtesy, a closing of the loop. But William declined. For years, he had shouldered the burden of being the one who kept trying, the one who remained silent, the one who withheld his truth while his brother broadcast his. And now, with the world watching, William made a different choice. He said nothing. There was no call. Harry, for his part, reportedly waited, not with hope, perhaps, but with a sense of habit. Birthdays had always been a bridge, an excuse to connect. Even during the most strained of times, there had been text messages, short calls, something. But not this year. This year, the phone stayed silent. According to sources in Montecito, Harry tried to stay composed. When the story broke in the British press, first as a whisper, then a roar, he didn't publicly respond. Meghan, fiercely protective as always, allegedly advised him to take the high road, to focus on his children, his work, his own birthday plans in September. But even those closest to him said they could see it in his eyes. It hurt, not because of the party, not because of the optics, but because it meant William was truly done. And that meant something was officially over. Back in the UK, palace staff took quiet notice of the media reaction. The coverage was swift. Harry not invited to William's birthday bash made the front pages. Pundits debated what it meant. Analysts dissected the guest list. Social media lit up with theories and blame. Team Harry. Team William. Team no one. Team just make up already. But within Kensington, there was no backpedaling. No damage control. The decision had been made not for the public, but in spite of them. William had drawn the boundary not because it was politically advantageous, but because it was emotionally necessary. And when the evening of the birthday finally arrived, it was, by all accounts, lovely. There were toasts, laughter, quiet music in the background, speeches made by old friends. Kate raised a glass. George and Charlotte brought hand-drawn cards. Louis, still cheeky as ever, handed his father a small, messy cupcake before accidentally dropping it on the floor. But among the cheer, there was an absence. Not spoken of, not mourned, but present all the same. An empty chair that no one mentioned. And William didn't need to say anything, because he already had. By not inviting Harry, by not making the call, by not pretending everything was fine, William had made one of the most emotionally significant decisions of his adult life. He had chosen peace. Not reconciliation. Not revenge. Just peace. The kind that comes when you finally accept someone will not change. When you stop waiting for apologies that never arrive. When you realize that protecting your own family, your wife, your children, your sanity, is more important than the fantasy of a brotherhood that no longer exists. It was his birthday. And this year, the gift he gave himself wasn't anything wrapped in ribbon or tied in protocol. It was distance. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the right decision. When the news finally reached Prince Harry that he was not on the guest list for his brother's 43rd birthday, it came not with a shout or a confrontation, but with the low, icy thud of confirmation. For months, he had felt the distance growing. For years, he had watched the cracks widen between them. And now, there it was. Official. Complete. William had drawn the line. There was no phone call. No text. not even a formal statement, which Harry might have almost appreciated for its finality. Instead, the confirmation came in waves. First, a discreet whisper from someone still connected to palace circles. Then, within hours, the first British tabloids had caught on. Prince Harry not invited to William's birthday bash, the headline blared. And just like that, the wound was no longer private. For Harry, it wasn't about the party. Not really. It was about what it symbolized. He hadn't expected a grand gesture. He hadn't even expected forgiveness. But deep down, there was still a flicker of hope that despite all that had happened, despite everything said in books and interviews and documentaries, there remained a sliver of brotherhood, a whisper of the boys they used to be. But that whisper had now gone silent. According to friends close to the Sussex circle, Harry had been preparing himself for this outcome long before the headline dropped. In private, he had acknowledged the likelihood that William would make this kind of decision. After all, it wasn't the first time his brother had iced him out. But this one cut deeper. Because birthdays had always been sacred. Growing up, no matter how complicated their lives were, birthdays were the one tradition that never wavered. Whether it was breakfast in bed at Kensington, surprise gifts hidden around Balmoral, or Diana's handwritten notes tucked under their pillows, birthdays had been the rare constant in their chaotic world. Even after Diana's death, even after their lives were pulled into separate royal orbits, the brothers had always managed to find a way to acknowledge each other on their special day. A call, a toast, a shared laugh. It wasn't just about celebrating, it was about anchoring. And now, for the first time in his life, that anchor had been cut. Privately, Harry spent the day in Montecito with Meghan and the children. There was no dramatic outburst, no visible meltdown. But those around him say he was quieter than usual, more introspective, at times withdrawn. Meghan noticed it immediately. She had been bracing for it too. As much as Harry had wanted to believe reconciliation was possible, she had long since accepted that the divide between the two brothers was no longer about words. It was about identity. William was the heir, bound by tradition, legacy, and protocol. Harry was the outsider, the truth-teller, the rebel. Two lives too far apart to meet in the middle anymore. Still, watching Harry grapple with that truth, again, broke something in her. That night, as the family gathered for their own small celebration in Montecito, one filled with their usual warmth and privacy, Harry reportedly stepped away for a moment, out onto the terrace, alone with the quiet California breeze and the memories of what once was. No photographers, no press, just silence. Inside, Meghan tried to maintain normalcy. She lit candles, played soft music, and kept the children entertained. But her thoughts kept drifting back to her husband, the man who had given up everything to protect her, the man who now stood alone in ways no one outside their walls could fully understand. For Harry, the birthday snub didn't come as a surprise, but that didn't make it hurt any less. He didn't need to be in the room with William to feel the absence. Because for Harry, the loss wasn't about missing a dinner or a toast. It was about what had been lost along the way. The brotherhood that had once been unshakable. The laughter. The whispered jokes during long state ceremonies. The glances shared during awkward public engagements. The sense that no matter how strange their world became, they would always have each other. And now, they didn't. The memory of their last serious conversation played over in Harry's mind like a scratchy reel. He could still see William's face, tight-lipped, eyes hard, posture stiff. The words exchanged had been raw, but not cruel. Honest, but cold. And then, silence. Weeks turned to months. Texts went unanswered. Emails ignored. Each interaction a little more strained than the last. Until the silence became the default. And now, with this birthday, William had put a stamp on that silence. Back in the UK, royal commentators speculated endlessly about Harry's state of mind. Devastated, one claimed. Furious, said another. But the truth was more complicated. He wasn't devastated. He was resigned. There's a kind of grief that comes not from sudden loss, but from the slow, grinding erosion of something you thought would last forever. Harry had watched that erosion for years. With each unreturned message. With each dodged encounter. With every cold glance across cathedral pews. Until finally, it wasn't a relationship anymore. It was a memory. In the days that followed, Harry went back to work. He resumed meetings for Archwell, prepped for upcoming travel, and continued his commitments to Invictus. But those around him said something in him had shifted. He no longer spoke about when we reconnect. He no longer suggested that next time, things might be different. The birthday had sealed it. There would be no next time. There was no dramatic fallout. No angry phone call to the palace. No rage-fueled emails. Just a quiet acceptance. A silent acknowledgement that sometimes, even in families, the gap becomes too wide to cross. Harry had once believed that the strength of their shared past would eventually pull them back together. That the loss of their mother, the pain of the spotlight, the unique insanity of royal life would ultimately be the glue that held them. But he was wrong. Sometimes, even shared pain isn't enough. And so, he let go. Not out of bitterness, but because it was time. The man who had once walked behind his mother's casket with his brother beside him now walked alone. Not because he wanted to, but because the path forward no longer allowed space for both of them. William had made his choice. And now, Harry was learning how to live with it. When the headlines about Prince William's birthday made their way to the sun-drenched hills of Montecito, Meghan Markle was already anticipating the ripple effect. She had seen it before, public royal decisions cloaked in private messaging. No words needed to be spoken. No quote had to be issued. The act alone sent the signal. And Meghan understood the signal clearly. From the moment Harry walked into the room, phone in hand, his expression etched with restrained disappointment, Meghan knew what it meant. No call. No invitation. No gesture. William's birthday would come and go, and Harry would remain where he was, not just physically, but emotionally on the outside. To the world, this was just another headline. Another chapter in the endlessly dissected saga of the House of Windsor. But to Meghan, this was personal. The reaction that came from her wasn't loud or theatrical. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices. That wasn't her way, not anymore. But beneath the calm, beneath the composed exterior she had carefully honed over years of press scrutiny and public attack, there was a rising fury. Not because she was surprised, but because it confirmed everything she had feared about the royal family from the beginning. To her, the snub wasn't just about a birthday, it was about control, about power, about sending a clear message that no matter how much Harry had tried to reconcile, no matter how often they'd expressed love for their family even amid painful truth-telling, the doors had been closed. Locked. Bolted. She didn't say much at first. Just listened to Harry, nodded slowly, and sat beside him in quiet solidarity. But later, as they prepared dinner, her thoughts began to churn, loud and relentless. How had it come to this? She had once believed, maybe naively, that love would be enough. That once the family saw how happy Harry was, once they saw how strong their union had become, the acceptance would follow. She had given them the benefit of the doubt, even after the snide headlines and stilted greetings. But what she witnessed instead was a slow-motion rejection. One Christmas not invited. One christening skipped. Then came the cold looks during public events. The whispered accusations. And now this, an unspoken disinvitation that everyone could read between the lines of. Meghan, in private, viewed it not as William choosing peace, but as William choosing sides. And to her, it stung not just because of what it meant for Harry, but because she knew the world would once again circle back to her. The headlines wouldn't say William rejects Harry. They would say William freezes out Meghan and Harry. Even when she wasn't the one at the center, she would still be pulled into the storm. And part of her had grown tired of it. Exhausted, really. For years, Meghan had endured a kind of public dissection few could imagine. Her race, her past, her ambitions, her marriage, all examined under the sharpest microscope. And through it all, she tried to play the game. Smile when necessary. Stay silent when screamed at. Choose dignity when baited. But this was different. Because this wasn't a headline. This was Harry's brother. The man who stood beside him through everything. The loss of their mother. The trauma of growing up in a spotlight. The forced smiles at family events. The whispered conversations after duty-filled days. And now, that man had cut Harry out of something as basic as a birthday celebration. To Meghan, that wasn't just cold. It was cruel. And yet, she also knew Harry wouldn't retaliate. That wasn't who he was. So Meghan did what she had always done. She pulled the weight for both of them. Behind the scenes, she refocused the household. She reminded the team to stay silent on the issue, to decline media inquiries with grace. She shifted Archwell's messaging back to charitable causes and ongoing projects. Not a word about the birthday snub would be said publicly, but in her quiet spaces, away from staff and advisors, she vented. To her journal, to her closest friends. In private, whispered calls across oceans. She didn't need to scream to feel enraged. What frustrated her the most was the hypocrisy of it all. Here was a family that claimed unity, forgiveness, and duty. Yet time and time again, they had made decisions rooted not in healing, but in punishment. She thought of the Queen, of how things might have been different if Elizabeth were still alive. Say what one might about the monarchy's rigidity, Elizabeth had a steadiness that prevented outright fracture. With her gone, the threads had snapped. And in Meghan's view, William had no intention of tying them back together. She also worried about the children. Archie and Lilibet were still young. But one day, they would read the stories. They would ask questions. They would want to know why they didn't see their cousins. Why Grandpa Charles only visited during official trips. Why Uncle William never called. And how would they explain it? Meghan's maternal instinct flared at the thought. Because if her children were to feel rejected by the family that should have embraced them, she would have no tolerance for it. She could handle being excluded. She had done it before. But she would not allow her children to be made to feel lesser. Especially not because of her or Harry's choices to live truthfully. In that quiet fury, Meghan found clarity. They were done chasing acceptance. They were done waiting for invitations that never came. For too long, Harry had walked the tightrope between duty and authenticity. For too long, she had bit her tongue for the sake of appearances. And now, the silence from Kensington was confirmation that no amount of compromise, humility, or patience would change the course the firm had chosen. So she turned that energy inward, into protection, into family, into building something that didn't require royal approval to be valuable. She wouldn't speak about the birthday. Not now. Maybe not ever. But if the time came, and it always did, she would be ready. With the receipts. With the truth. With the steady, calm voice she had learned to hone in a world that often wanted her to break. Because Meghan Markle had already faced the worst they could throw at her. And she was still standing. Fiercely. Quietly. Furious. As the headlines roared and the public dissected Prince William's birthday guest list, or more accurately, the conspicuous absence from it, one institution stood firm, unmoved by the noise. Buckingham Palace said absolutely nothing. No denial. No explanation. No off-the-record whispers to trusted reporters. The palace, true to its time-honored philosophy, chose complete and strategic silence. To most institutions, silence during a media storm suggests weakness. In the age of instant response, PR spin, and viral rumors, silence can look like guilt. But within the walls of the British monarchy, silence is not absence, it's presence. A presence of calculation, of control, of understanding that sometimes the loudest message is delivered without a word. The firm, as insiders and palace staff often call it, has survived not just centuries, but scandals, wars, abdications, affairs, leaks, assassination attempts, divorces, deaths, public backlash, and shifting cultural tides. Through all of it, one thing has preserved the monarchy more than tradition, more than wealth, more than bloodlines: silence. It's a strategy built on the idea that the crown is above the fray. Let others squabble in the headlines. Let emotions spill in interviews and social media storms. The monarchy survives because it is constant, unmoved, and unshaken. It does not explain itself. It does not need your understanding. It simply continues. And in the case of Harry's exclusion from William's birthday, that silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. Senior aides within the palace were undoubtedly aware of the media frenzy that would follow the news. They knew royal watchers would dissect it, Page 6 would pounce, and Harry and Meghan's name would be inevitably tied to every article. But they also knew that the one thing they couldn't afford to do was engage. Because engagement, in any form, would legitimize the narrative that this was a feud. And the palace doesn't do feuds. It does distance. It does preservation. And most importantly, it does control. Control over messaging. Control over perception. And above all, control over the illusion that everything behind those palace walls is stable, orderly, and drama-free, even when it's not. So while the press ran wild with theories, insiders, and unnamed sources, the official royal communication channels carried on like normal. Updates about engagements, charities, school visits, and military events filled the court circular. William and Kate were photographed smiling at a local community center 2 days after his birthday. There was no mention of Harry. No reference to who was or wasn't there. Just business as usual. But make no mistake, behind the scenes, the choice to exclude Harry had not been spontaneous. It had been discussed, debated, strategized. According to sources close to palace staff, the decision wasn't simply William's to make. It was a consensus. A quiet agreement among senior aides and family members that this was the moment to draw the line. For years, the palace had endured the Sussex storm with near-total restraint. From Oprah to Spare to podcast clips and Netflix specials, the royal household held fast to its policy of never complain, never explain. But with every public revelation Harry made, the internal belief within the palace solidified. Enough was enough. The decision to not invite Harry to William's birthday was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of protection. Protection of William's peace. Protection of Catherine's dignity. Protection of the monarchy's future. They could not afford another awkward photo. Another strained conversation overheard by lip readers. Another moment of staged reconciliation for the sake of press optics. This time, the message was clear, and the silence around it was deafening. Behind closed doors, royal press officers kept a close eye on public sentiment. In the UK, reactions skewed heavily in William's favor. He's had enough, one morning show commentator said. He's the future king. He can't keep entertaining a brother who keeps airing the family's laundry. But in the US, where the Sussexes still retained significant sympathy, the tone was more conflicted. Was this yet another instance of the royal family shunning someone for being too honest? Was the monarchy repeating its patterns, punishing those who dared break the cycle of silence? Yet even in the midst of that backlash, the palace remained still. Because their silence did something clever, it forced the public to fill in the blanks. And people did. They projected. They speculated. They argued with one another. But while they were doing that, the palace stood tall, regal, quiet, and entirely above it. This is the power of controlled silence. It creates distance. It creates mystique. And perhaps most importantly, it keeps the monarchy looking like it's still in control, even if it's quietly crumbling behind the scenes. Insiders say that William himself has adopted this same strategy. In years past, he might have struggled to contain his emotions. He is, after all, fiercely loyal and quick to temper when those he loves are criticized. But in recent years, he has reportedly adopted more of his grandmother's style: tight lips, measured actions, and an unshakable belief in the institution. The silence surrounding Harry's exclusion is not weakness. It's a message, and the message is this: William is no longer in the business of negotiating his private life for public perception. He's done giving second chances. He's done offering invitations that become headlines. He's done being the quiet one while his brother becomes the narrator. This silence was not a lack of communication. It was communication in its purest royal form. And the palace made sure it stayed that way. No leaks from senior staff. No side comments from footmen. No slips to friendly journalists. Just silence. A silence so carefully engineered that it said everything it needed to say without a single word. That's the paradox of the royal family. They are surrounded by noise, camera flashes, tabloid stories, commentary from experts and armchair critics, and yet their greatest weapon remains the simplest one. They say nothing. Because in a world where everyone is shouting, silence can sound like thunder. And this time, it echoed from the marble halls of Kensington Palace all the way to the hills of California. The day itself arrived with little fanfare, at least on the surface. June 21st, Prince William's 43rd birthday. The skies over Windsor were a quiet gray, the kind of mild British weather that neither demanded attention nor distracted from it. To the outside world, it was business as usual. A few modest headlines. A flurry of tweets from royal watchers. A brief mention on the BBC's morning news recap. But behind the stone walls of Adelaide Cottage, nestled in the royal grounds of Windsor, a carefully planned, intimate gathering was underway, one that had been designed not just as a celebration of the heir to the throne, but as a moment of symbolic reset. There would be no grand reception hall. No celebrity chefs or 1,000-pound cakes. This wasn't that kind of event. William had made it clear from the beginning that he wanted something simple, grounded, personal. After all, this wasn't a public affair. It was a reflection of the life he had carved for himself amidst the tidal waves of royal duty. Inside the walls of the cottage, the rooms were set with understated elegance. Candles flickered in soft corners. Music played gently in the background, an instrumental playlist that mingled classical pieces with acoustic modern tunes. It wasn't showy. It was home. The kind of setting where the Prince of Wales could momentarily stop being the future king and just be a man surrounded by those he trusted most. The guest list had been kept intentionally short. Only those within the most trusted ring had been invited. There were no diplomats. No extended cousins from obscure royal branches. No members of the media with conveniently timed press passes. Instead, it was the core. Kate, of course, had overseen much of the planning. Her style of hosting had always been warm, inclusive, and quietly thoughtful. She had personally picked the floral arrangements, peonies and hydrangeas, William's favorites. The cake was homemade by the children with the help of their longtime nanny, and though it leaned heavily in the direction of chaotic, sugary madness, William adored it. Prince George was the first to present his gift, a carefully drawn portrait of the family, labeled in his now surprisingly precise handwriting. Charlotte followed with a handmade card tucked inside a poetry book she picked herself. And Louis, ever the wild card, offered a mismatched Lego set that he insisted they build together after dinner. William beamed. These weren't just moments of parenting. These were symbols of stability, of legacy, of a life grounded in something beyond ceremony. Among the adults, familiar faces offered a sense of continuity. Close friends from William's school days. A handful of royal aides who had served not just loyally, but personally. Individuals who had seen him through heartbreak, pressure, and transition. People who didn't flinch when the news cycle exploded or when family dynamics grew too tense to discuss. One notable attendee was Peter Phillips, the son of Princess and William's cousin. Though he tended to stay out of the media spotlight, Peter had always maintained a close relationship with both William and Harry. But tonight, he was here only for the former. Zara Tyndall and her husband Mike were there too. Their presence added a bit of humor and levity. Mike's jokes could cut through any tension, and Zara's bond with Kate provided a quiet support throughout the evening. The cousins, though never seeking headlines, had long served as a kind of grounding presence in William's life. Loyal without being sycophantic. Understanding without probing. The evening's highlight wasn't a toast or a gift, it was a conversation. One that unfolded slowly, around the dinner table, as laughter gave way to reflection. William spoke softly but deliberately about the year that had passed. He didn't mention Harry by name, not once. But everyone in the room understood the undertones. He thanked those present for their friendship, for their discretion, for standing by him through a year that tested not just his patience, but his principles. He made a quiet reference to walking the line between duty and dignity, and those who knew him best recognized it for what it was, a nod to the pressure of remaining silent in a storm that begged him to shout. Later, when the plates were cleared and the candles began to burn lower, William stepped out briefly onto the cottage's back terrace. Kate followed, not far behind. They didn't speak for several moments. Just stood, hands gently clasped, watching the trees sway in the midsummer night air. They had weathered a lot together. The Jubilee, the Queen's death, Harry's memoir, the Netflix storm. And now, the public knowledge that William had chosen firmly, finally, not to open his birthday celebration to his only brother. Kate didn't ask him if he was okay. She didn't need to. She knew what this decision cost him. Not politically, but personally. William had always been the steady one, the peacemaker, the bridge. And now, he had chosen to stop trying. It was both necessary and heartbreaking. Inside, guests continued to mingle. Quiet conversations flowed about everything from childhood memories to the kids' upcoming school holidays. There were no tense political debates, no whispers about tabloid rumors. For one night, at least, the air was clear. And while Harry's name never passed anyone's lips, his absence hung in the space between conversations. Not like a ghost, but like a missing photo from a frame. No one mentioned it, but everyone noticed. There had been a time when birthdays meant phone calls between the brothers. Jokes, ribbing, maybe a pint shared at the pub or a secret rendezvous away from the spotlight. There had been a time when the only people who truly understood the madness of royal life were each other. But those days were gone, and as the night wound down, and the final guests trickled out into the cool Windsor air, William returned once more to the terrace. He looked up at the stars, not for answers, but perhaps for a moment of peace. He knew the press would have a field day. He knew Harry would read the headlines. He knew people would take sides. But in that quiet, candlelit evening, surrounded by people who had stayed, who had shown up, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Just stillness. A brief pause in the unrelenting march of royal life. And it was enough. It wasn't in a grand room. There was no staff present, no aides hovering outside the door, no formal arrangement of seating and security. It happened in a side room tucked away from the public eye, a place within the walls of Windsor Castle where history had watched hundreds of family conflicts bloom and die without a trace. The only record of this meeting would live inside the memory of two men who once stood shoulder to shoulder and now stood worlds apart. The last time Prince William and Prince Harry sat in a room together alone, there was no shouting, no raised voices. But the silence between them was so thick it felt like the walls themselves could feel it. This was shortly after the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. At the time, the public had hoped that grief might serve as a salve, that the death of the monarch who had ruled for over 70 years and held the family together through sheer force of presence might compel her grandsons to take a step back and reconsider what had become of them. The funeral had done what few events could. It brought them together physically. They walked side by side behind their grandmother's casket, just as they had once done for their mother. They stood in the same solemn lines, nodded to the same dignitaries, and stood together, shoulder to shoulder, as the world mourned. But beneath the surface, the tension was as raw as ever. So when William quietly asked Harry to speak privately after the ceremonial obligations were done, the offer came with both surprise and skepticism. Harry agreed, but he arrived at the meeting already guarded, already wary. They met in one of the smaller drawing rooms, surrounded by old portraits and quiet furnishings that had outlived their ancestors. For a few moments, they didn't speak. The weight of everything unsaid hung over the space like fog. William, always the more composed of the two, started first. He didn't bring up Spare. Not directly, but the way he spoke made it clear that it had shattered something between them. He used phrases like, "You crossed the line," and "there are things that should never have been said." Not because the events described were necessarily false, but because they were once sacred, and now they were public. Harry, in turn, didn't apologize. He didn't backpedal. He explained. He tried to convey that the memoir hadn't been written in anger but in pain, that it was a long-brewing attempt to make sense of a lifetime of feeling misunderstood, minimized, and pushed aside. William didn't raise his voice, but his frustration was visible in every twitch of his jaw, every shift in posture. He asked, plainly, "What did you think would happen?" And Harry had no simple answer. Because on one level, he knew exactly what would happen. That William would be hurt. That Charles would feel betrayed. That Catherine would withdraw even further. But on another level, he believed that maybe, just maybe, truth would bring clarity. That if everything were out in the open, they could finally start again from a place of honesty. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, the book became a wall. In this meeting, this final private conversation, was their last chance to chip at that wall before it turned to concrete. Harry told William that he had never wanted to burn it all down, that his intention wasn't destruction, but liberation. But to William, the damage was the same. Intention didn't matter when trust was broken. He spoke about loyalty, about the burden of being next in line, about what it meant to stay silent even when people screamed your name in criticism, and that Harry, by choosing public exposure, had taken a road William could never follow. There were moments in the conversation where they softened. When they mentioned Diana, the grief returned like a familiar ache. For a brief few minutes, they remembered their shared boyhood. The nights they whispered jokes in their shared room. The Christmas mornings at Sandringham. Their trips to Africa. The time they tackled each other into a freezing river because they were bored and the press was too far to hear their laughter. But those memories, as precious as they were, couldn't rewrite the present. William, at one point, asked, "Why didn't you come to me first?" Harry looked him in the eye and said, "I tried. You didn't hear me." And that was the rift in a single exchange. William believed Harry had betrayed him by going public. Harry believed William had betrayed him by never listening. And in that divide, neither man felt wrong. They didn't shout, but their silence was just as loud. Eventually, the conversation wound down, not with resolution, not even with a promise to try again. They shook hands, an awkward, distant gesture that once would have been a brotherly hug. William turned first. Harry watched him walk out. And just like that, the door closed behind him. That was the last time they spoke privately, face to face. Since then, every interaction had been mediated, scheduled, surrounded by protocol. There were polite nods during King Charles's first formal events, muted greetings at official occasions, but nothing resembling what they once had. And now, with the birthday snub made official, Harry replayed that last conversation in his mind over and over. Not because he was searching for answers, but because he realized that moment had been the last real opportunity they had to salvage anything. They had spoken as brothers, and left as strangers. William, for his part, never brought the conversation up again. When asked by close confidants how it went, his response was short. "We're not on the same path." And maybe that was the truth they both couldn't say aloud in that room. that their journeys, once parallel, had veered so far apart that there was no common road left between them. One stayed for duty, the other left for freedom, and both were paying the price in different ways. Now, as William aged into his role as future king, and Harry carved out a new life across an ocean, that final conversation served as a quiet memorial. A moment in time when two brothers truly tried, to reach across the chasm, and failed. There were no final words of closure, no parting sentiments, no "I love yous" exchanged in whispered tones. Just the closing of a door, the sound of footsteps fading, and the echo of a silence that would grow louder with each passing year.